Us today, and welcome to the event Applying Theory-Based Approaches to Assess the Transformational Outcomes in Advocacy and Capacity Building. Whether you have extensively applied theory-based approaches to your evaluation work, or you are looking to include them for the first time, or you just want to connect and exchange ideas on how to apply the assessment of capacity building and advocacy, we are happy to have you here today. My name is Zahra Popatia, and I work in the Knowledge Translation Unit at Global Affairs Canada, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I'd like to highlight a few housekeeping points. Please note that the event is recorded so that we can share it with a broader audience. I encourage you to share your thoughts and questions with us and each other throughout the event. Please engage with us using the chat and pose your questions in the Q&A app. If you'd like to connect with us directly, I will drop our email address into the chat. But to open today's panel, I invite Mathieu Audet, our fearless director of the Evaluation Unit at Global Affairs Canada.
All right. Thanks, Zahra. Bonjour tout le monde. So I'm Mathieu Audet, Director of Evaluation at Global Affairs Canada, and it's a pleasure to open today's event. Today, we'll be discussing a topic that's at the heart of our work as evaluators. So our mandate is to deliver credible, systematic, and actionable evidence for decision-making. And for this, it's critical to have access to approaches that capture the nature and complexity of the interventions we evaluate. So at Global Affairs Canada, my team, which is many of which are gathered here today, is focused on assessing the relevance and performance of a wide breadth of Canada's international engagement, from development assistance, humanitarian aid, security relations, trade, and more. Increasingly, many of these activities include advocacy and capacity building work. Similarly, we've seen that across many partners, donors, and UN agencies, advocacy and capacity building has become part of transformational strategies and critical to organizational functions supporting the achievement of SDGs. So why did we organize this event, and why does it matter? So as we've recently completed evaluations of advocacy and capacity building programs, we've seen firsthand how assessing the outcomes and establishing causation for such interventions remains a very real challenge. The nature of behavior change and systems change targeted by such interventions is quite complex. And transformational change, we recognize it takes time, consistent effort, and more importantly, we feel it feeds off of favorable context and that a number of key drivers all work in sync. So as for the evaluation methods, there are limited options and opportunities to apply traditional counterfactual approaches. And often evaluations of these types of interventions struggle to go beyond accounts of performed activities and generated outputs with, anecdotal evidence of some success stories and how they could be leading into outcomes. So our goal today is to present two examples demonstrating our progress in producing more credible and systematic evidence on the outcomes of advocacy and capacity building efforts, as well as our methods for systematically identifying factors that support or hinder the transformational change I was just speaking of. Both of our examples apply theory-based approaches, develop and test an intervention for the theory of change, and integrate the assessment of behavior drivers into that program theory. So I have three members of my team with me today. I have Silvia Grandi, Eugenia Didenko, and Bénite Mandaka, who have recently gone through the process of designing and implementing and assessing the assessment of behavioral, organizational, and system-level outcomes related to advocacy and capacity building. But we're also joined today by Giovanna Voltolina from Itad, who joins us from the UK, Drew Koleros from Mathematica, who joins us from the US, and Khadija Maiga, an independent consultant based in Mali, who has supported and guided my team throughout this process. So just in closing, I encourage you, just like Zahra said, I encourage you all to participate actively during the event and to reach out to us afterwards. We're looking to spark a conversation on this, and things will only get better if we share ideas following these conversations. So with that, Zahra, I'll pass it back on to you.
Thank you, Mathieu. As Mathieu said, we have 2 presentations. We will take a few questions at the end of each presentation. We will have a longer exchange at the end of the second presentation where we will explore the similarities and differences between the presented approaches, as well as broader questions related to the use of program theories and what evaluators need in order to successfully apply these methodologies. As we get ready for our first presentation, I invite you to answer a few questions to get a sense of who is in the audience and what are some of the main challenges you've had in evaluating programs that have less tangible outcomes. Please go to the Menti link you see on your screen and record your responses. Can you see the Menti? Great. So the first question asks you to rate your level of familiarity with theory-based approaches available to evaluate advocacy or capacity building interventions. Please select one of the 5 options that best represent your level of familiarity. You can either click on the link that should be in the chat or use the code that's provided there. Just give a few seconds for people to chime in here. Can someone put the link in the chat just for those who can't get on using the QR code? Great. Just give another second for anyone else who wants to answer the question here. There we go. There's the link if anyone needs it. Great. Well, perfect. It looks like we have a good spread of a variety of familiarity levels, and hopefully this presentation will help you build your toolbox a little bit more, answer some of your questions, get you more familiar. And if you are new to this, hopefully you'll take a chance and start applying some of these tools. Our second question asks for those who do have some experience in this evaluation approach to reflect on the most significant challenges you have come across in assessing such interventions. If you can just throw out your responses on some of the challenges you faced, that would be great. And we can hopefully unpack this throughout the presentation as we go on. So go back to the Menti link, the next slide, if you could throw out any responses you have in any of the challenges you have come across in assessing such interventions. Feel free to put anything out there and we'll hopefully address them. So I see here poor theory of change to test against, funders' insistence on conventional tools, intervention length too short, never done it, acknowledge relationships, measuring organizational change, poor quality, it's overwhelming, unclear indicators, strength of evidence, data challenges. So it looks like there is quite a few of data issues here, never done it before. I see a lot of issues on attribution, impact of external factor, identifying meaningful measures, data sensitivities come up. This is great, thank you. I'll just let a few more people chime in if there's anything else. Assumptions that change is predictable. That sounds familiar. Great. Okay. Thanks for participating. I will now turn to Silvia from Global Affairs Canada and Giovanna for Itad, who will kick off this roundtable by speaking about their work identifying, understanding, and measuring the effectiveness of advocacy and influencing efforts. The presenters will provide an overview of the evaluation context and the program, then discuss the development of advocacy assessment framework and key learnings. At the end of the presentation, we'll have some time for questions, and I'll pass it to Silvia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zahra. And thank you everyone for joining us today and for giving us an opportunity to share this experience with all of you. So as Zahra mentioned, I'll start by setting the stage, and I'll pass it over to Giovanna Voltolina from Itad to go into all the interesting details. In 2022, our evaluation division at Global Affairs Canada undertook an evaluation of the Canada's Fund for Local Initiatives. This is one of the longest running programs that we have in our department. It's more than 50 years old. And it's an interesting program because every year it funds approximately 600 local short-term projects in more than 150 countries using Canada's international assistance envelope. Decision-making is decentralized to missions, and over 80% of projects are implemented by local civil society organizations. It's also interesting because it has a hybrid purpose. It is a foreign policy tool, so it is meant to expand Canada's diplomacy by advancing Canadian values and interests through partnerships with local organizations. But at the same time, it's also meant to contribute to Canada's international assistance priorities. So as we embarked in this evaluation, we realized very early on that we were faced with a few challenges. Some of those actually that you put in that initial slide really resonated with me. But so the first one was really broad in nature. So as diplomacy, of course, is one of our core functions in our department, there's traditionally been a certain reluctance or maybe skepticism about the ability to measure results of such a soft, intangible line of activity. So this is, of course, not a new area for evaluators, but for our departments, we were definitely facing both maybe a lack of culture, but also tools to be able to systematically assess results in this area. The other two challenges were more specific to CFLI. As we all know, advocacy results take a long time to materialize. As I mentioned before, here we're dealing with very short-term projects. So how can we actually tell a meaningful story of impact? And the second one had to do with data, as many of you mentioned. So CFLI in its own monitoring reporting structures was more inclined to collect quantitative data and not as much stories of change. So we looked for help, and we found Itad. And we asked them to do two main things. The first one was to help us kind of fill a data gap for our evaluation. Oh, sorry, I need to go to my next. Oh, no, just the same slide. So provide one of the lines of evidence for our evaluation. But we also realized that there was an interest in the department and in the program, in the CFLI program specifically, to have an adaptable, useful framework and tools to be able to capture this type of results. And also we wanted to learn as an evaluation practice what we could do better. So with these ambitious objectives, we passed the ball to Itad, and now I pass the floor to Jo. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvia. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Well, it's my job to tell you about what we did and how. So what did we do? You can click enter. So first we sampled. During the evaluation, we found that grantees really valued that CFLI grants aren't prescriptive. But this diversity is great for the program, but it's a challenge for the evaluation. So we first sampled for convenience to choose the Canadian missions who had time to engage with the evaluation. We also set criteria to sample themes within those missions. And within those countries and themes, we asked the missions and grantees to recruit people who could inform our evaluation of CFLI. And the result was that we carried out 8 case studies looking at a selection of themes, for example, indigenous rights and natural resources management, women economic empowerment in different countries. Second, we built the framework. I will tell you about this soon, but for now I'll say we built the framework in conversation with CFLI staff, and we piloted it in 2 countries by collecting and analyzing data. And then we followed with 6 more countries and synthesized data across case studies with cross-case generalization. And thirdly, we handed over these tools to CFLI and Canadian missions so they could start at least trying to embed them in their work. Next slide, please. Now on to the model. The focus was collecting data that could help understand the relationship between CFLI and any changes in behavior, relationships, activities, or actions of people in alignment with Canadian interests and values. And these are all the questions on the right, which I'm not going to go through. And I'm also not going to go through the left, which is an attempt at fitting the simplified model on the left. But the way we did it was we started by focusing on actors. So on the left is a simplified model of how these desired change were meant to happen. Next slide. And now I'm going to spend a bit of time on this slide. This is the evidence collation framework. So as Silvia said, the challenge was collating evidence that could be used. And as I said, we started with an actor focus. So that's that first row in the model, more to come. We started with an actor focus, but which actors? So CFLI gives grants. So we looked at these grantees. Who were they? How were they being selected, and were they the right ones to be reaching and influencing others? So this is the first part that went into the framework. Are their motivations aligned with Canada's values? Was CFLI selecting the right people? Second, CFLI's grants are tiny and they don't expect to change the world or entire countries. And this meant that we had to look at things in a realistic way, identifying stepping stones or meaning milestones for key actors whose behavior CFLI intended to influence. And this is where 2 frameworks came to our help, COM-B and PI. Let's start with COM-B, which is at the bottom of this slide. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but let's say, for those who aren't familiar with it, that COM-B is a behavior change framework by Susan Michi and colleagues, which looks at behavior change as a result of changes in the capabilities, opportunities, and motivations of actors to enact a target behavior. So in our framework, the motivation part was covered by the first row. CFLI was selecting partners who already had motivations aligned with Canada and needed grant money to pursue their objectives. But CFLI staff in countries also provided technical support to their grantees. This is something we found grantees really loved. And so they were really increasing organizations' capacity, often being the trampoline grant for these grassroots organizations to be able to apply for bigger grants and have more impact. So giving opportunities led to more opportunities. And the second framework that helped us was PI, which stands for Political Access, Advocacy and Influencing. And it's a framework that Itad had previously used in CSSF. And it was helpful because it recognized that creating opportunities to access influential stakeholders is usually the first step to influencing. It also recognizes that small tokens of alignment and collaboration along the way are key. And while we all know these things, and we know that these things matter, we often leave them implicit in our evaluation and in our monitoring. And we don't really spend time to collect data on these kind of marginal increases. They feel too small. But instead, putting them in a framework and collating evidence against them helped make them visible. And it gave establishing relations a bit of dignity and tangibility and palpability. And finally, looking at the last row, that's the part that collects evidence on positive things in the long term, let's call them that way. And in our case studies, it meant, for example, that a bill wasn't passed in Ghana, or that an indigenous women's group in a small Pacific island got what they wanted in natural resource management. And I mentioned that it was important to be realistic. We never considered talking about attribution. It's small grants, so we're always talking about contribution. I personally think we should always be talking about contribution, but that's a different matter. Next slide. And finally, what have we learned? So firstly, actor-based and COM-B informed approaches helped make our evaluation of advocacy tangible and realistic. And it reminded us that more than one thing needs to change to ensure behavior is changed. And that's, I think, one of the benefits of COM-B. A focus on access helped us recognize the stepping stones to change. And what I like about using these two models together is that while COM-B is sometimes criticized for being a bit too individualistic, too much about individual behavior change, integrating the PI framework, which has probably echoes of outcome mapping, perhaps, brings out the relational element. So the two frameworks support each other. And finally, on the evaluation design side, a note on something that is always true, but I think is particularly important and maybe a challenge when we talk about evaluating advocacy. I think we need to be honest about our confidence in findings. And I surely don't have time to talk about what makes for strong evidence, but it was a real challenge to interview people that grantees claimed to have influenced. So this is the typical challenge of only finding kind of straw in the wind type of evidence, if you're familiar with that terminology. So maybe a reminder and a lesson that we learned that we really need to fight for strength of evidence and yeah, make sure that we have a plan to reach as many sources of evidence, of strong evidence as possible. Over to you, Silvia.
Thank you. I'll add a few more words about sort of what we learned more from a Global Affairs Canada perspective. And the first thing that I wanted to mention is that thanks to this approach, we were able to really have some interesting finding and some interesting critical conversations around some of the findings. Some examples, for example, were around how there was a clear connection between positive advocacy outcomes when there was a clear selection strategy for partners. And this really sparked conversation among the program, the missions on how to better strategize for selection. So this is just one of the examples of how these findings were kind of integrated in the thinking on how to improve. But more broadly, maybe a point that I wanted to make, especially when we think about these very complex theory-based approaches, there's always a bit of a concern about how accessible these are. And I think something that Itad did very well in this case was to really try and have a pragmatic approach. As Joe showed, that the framework, the data collection framework, was a very stripped down tool at the end of the day that was really developed together with the program to make sure that was commensurate to the capacity of the program to actually implement it, but also that allowed some flexibility. So if some wanted to go full on in data collection, they could, but if they just had a bit of evidence, they could also use it. The other element that the program found very interesting was a template to develop stories of change that was a bit more systematic. So not just a comms story, but that was kind of really using the evidence to tell a story of change. And that also was seen as very useful. And the evaluation overall, this case studies brought some recommendations on how to incrementally improve the monitoring approach that CFLI had. So without really saying, okay, you have to completely have a full upheaval of your monitoring system, it was all about you can have incremental changes that could bring to improvements in your data. Then I feel this is a bit of a case study in itself of COM-B, because then to what extent did all of this actually got implemented? This is where, the best advice is faced with staff turnover, changes in priorities. So to be very honest with you, uptake has been slower than we were hoping for. At the same time, as internal evaluators, we are in a very privileged position. We can remain engaged. We can keep track of implementation over the longer time. We really pride ourselves on having a trusted advisor role. And so these allow us to continue engaging with the program. But it's just, I think, a reminder that any changes in behavior takes time and it takes motivation and beyond the capacity. So thank you so much. I think we have some time for a few questions. I will leave it to Khadija, to Zahra to give instructions on what's the best way to pose questions.
Yeah, so you can either add your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, which is the app on the top of your screen. The presenters have some time to answer any specific questions on the approach, any issues with how it was implemented if you want clarification. Okay, there's one question. Do you have any suggestions on integrating measures of advocacy and capacity building efforts in the traditional linear results framework?
Jo, would you like to give it a try and then I'll follow up?
Yeah, I can start. I can start taking it. I guess, as Silvia mentioned, this wasn't meant to be, again, like probably an evaluation as we usually would do it, because there's a plan of trying to integrate these tools into everyday routine monitoring, and that's why some of them don't, might not look like fully blown, super complicated tools. They were meant for integration. So I think there are several models that you could use to evaluate capacity building, which I'm not going to go into. I guess, there's Kirkpatrick, there is many. I would say if it's about integrating into everyday monitoring, you probably want to focus on some key changes and identify stepping stones there, and identify measures in that sense for those narrower kind of areas of focus. Was it difficult to implement? There was another question there. Was it difficult to implement? It was intense because we were doing case studies at the same time, and some of them were, well, we conducted them remotely, so some of them were 11 hours time difference in time zone. The small Pacific Islands one was lovely, but it made me wake up very early in the morning. So yes, I think the key difficulty in implementation was that strength of evidence thing I mentioned. I think with advocacy evaluations and diplomacy evaluations, there is a big element of wanting to find that piece of evidence that confirms that it was really the advocacy or the capacity building that contributed. And it's very hard to get to that, golden nugget. Most of the time you have this straw in the wind type of evidence that confirms maybe, or all in all, several pieces of evidence like that confirm your hypothesis, but they don't really feel like, yes, we have definitive proof. But I think that's the reality of what we're talking about and of the theme.
There are a few other questions in the chat. The first one is, would it be possible for you to share the actual interview tools with us that were used under COM-B and PAI?
I think we have 3 tools, I think, that we can share. One is the framework itself. One is one of the examples of the interview protocol. And the other one was a template for the case, for the change stories. So those we can share afterwards.
Great. Could you clarify, based on the example, what was the theory in the theory-based approach?
You can put the slide back.
Yes, but also, as I said, it's not kind of the full theory. I'm just trying to summarize it. But I think the beginning of it was we mapped actors starting with grantees, and then we looked at what the program was doing, and then we had 2 lines of types of outcomes, I guess. There was one element of the changes on the recipient organization side, and then the changes in what the people they interacted with were. And this is why it doesn't fit in a page. So, and then the theory of change that we based the framework on had this elements of combi and elements of political advocacy, access advocacy, and influencing that I mentioned earlier.
There's a related question in the chat. Were grantees required to develop a theory of change as part of their application? If yes, what role did those play in the evaluation? If no, after this evaluation, any plans? Any plans to ask this as part of the applications and support applicants with the development of the framework?
I feel Silvia can start.
Yeah, I can take this one. So I think there was a sort of a simplified. So many of these projects are really small at times, and in certain cases, it could even just be funding an event. So the application process included asking for expected results. It did not include developing a full theory of change. What the program had overall was an overarching theory of change. And that, again, going back to some of the initial comments, that was something that we found a bit complex to navigate because of that hybrid nature of the program. So the fact that it was at the same time trying to achieve international assistance goals and diplomacy goals. So it was a bit difficult to unpack those two. Because this is a very decentralized program. The center gives instructions and training to the missions, but then it's really much up to the missions to decide how they want to collect their applications, assess their applications. And so this was part of the reasons why we said, okay, we have this tool that we can share with you. They were developing sort of a broader they were updating their advocacy theory of change and indicators, and they took this example to sort of integrate in their update. And then, as I said, it was really up to the missions to decide how to proceed. I'm looking, actually, something that we do, thinking about that, being able to keep following up. We ask for an annual update on the implementation of our recommendations, and we're going to hear back from the program soon. So I'm very curious to see how things are going on this front.
I'm going to move to the next question. Can you give some examples of measuring marginal changes through these frameworks?
Yeah, sure. So as I said, the initial change that we were looking at was whether through these grants, organizations had channels to create access to stakeholders. So I guess we can go to the next slide, maybe that helps. But there is an advocacy, an access row. So that it's about entry points created or reinforced with relevant stakeholders. And then on the right-hand side, we have extend, where we put these different pieces of evidence. So when through data collection, we came across evidence that said, well, there wasn't a connection with this stakeholder, with this, for example, local decision maker or country level decision maker. But the grant gave a chance for the organization to access these kind of stakeholders and advocate. or bring something to the table. And then on the Canada side, it was also found that CFLI was creating, so funding these grants was also creating entry points to further advocate. And so one of these marginal increases was, are there new connections that are being made and used? And so the point of this framework, as you see it, is that over time, it allows missions, but also grantees, to start collating evidence every time they have one of these connections, and that helps tell a story over time. And it also helps kind of monitor relationships with decision makers. That's one example.
I'm going to take this final question before we move on. In terms of analysis, were there any online tools that you use to analyze the qualitative information versus quantitative data? If so, which ones, and what was your impression of them?
Yeah, so we didn't have, as Silvia said at the beginning, Itad was brought in mainly to complement these quant data that the broader evaluation was looking at. So we didn't look that much at quant data, also because these grants were so tiny. So we didn't see too much value.
Sorry, Jo, I think the question was about qualitative information.
Oh, sorry.
Online tools.
Okay.
Online tools to analyze qualitative information.
Yeah. So then the point was that we're focused on qualitative, and usually the way we do it at Itad is through MaxQDA, which is a qual software for analysis. But in this case, we really wanted to pretend that we were a mission, and we collated everything to Excel. And we said, how does it work if it's, if you have low capacity, low tech, and this doesn't get integrated anywhere and it's just a spreadsheet? And so we did it that way. And even the cross-case generalization across the 8 case studies we did on Excel.
Thank you. Thank you, Giovanna and Silvia. That was really insightful. I'd like to move on to the second presentation. If you have further questions, we'll save them to the end. We have time. Our second presentation will focus on the application of a conceptual framework called Actor-Based Change Framework to an evaluation of Global Affairs Canada's security capacity building programs. The presenters will start by introducing the programming context and its complexities, provide an overview of the Actor-Based Change Framework, and reflect on their experience in applying the framework. At the end of the presentation, as I said, there'll be time for questions. So keep pouring them into the Q&A or in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahra. We have a busy lineup of presenters, so I will jump right in. So last year, we completed an evaluation of 2 international security capacity building programs. These programs were created to prevent and respond to the threats posed by transnational organized crime and terrorism. As the program's name suggests, their main implementation strategy is through the delivery of capacity building assistance. And they're targeting a number of actors to increase their ability. So we're talking about states, government entities, and international and non-governmental organizations. So our evaluation planning revealed quite a lot of challenges in assessing the results of these programs. Our first challenge was the sheer complexity and variety of programming, which made us ask questions about who builds whose capacity, how, and why. This complexity included the types of funded capacity building interventions that range from training, provision of equipment, infrastructure, technical and legal assistance, support for cooperation, knowledge generation, and others. Funded projects differed considerably in terms of their intensity, provided assistance, their breadth, thematic area, choice of implementing partners, and they targeted different actor groups across multiple sectors. So that program complexity didn't make it easy for an evaluation. The true essence of capacity building is that it is a process that doesn't have standalone outcomes, but rather enables the achievement of outcomes across different sectors. Another challenge was highlighted in previous evaluations of the programs that repeatedly noted weaknesses in performance measurement. While the programs and projects have developed logic models and key performance indicators, those are based on a linear approach that treats the problem as one of capacity deficits and assumes that capabilities translate into desired change. It doesn't capture the many internal and external drivers of change, which are particularly important when we place that individual or group receiving capacity building support within the complex and dynamic political, institutional, and societal change. This was also the fourth evaluation of the programs that have operated for nearly 2 decades, and there was great interest in finding a way to more comprehensively demonstrate their results and factors that sustain the results, instead of highlighting a few firefly projects that have been done in the past. So in our search for the approach that would help us address existing limitations, we've come across a publication on the actor-based change framework, which offered a way to unpack how change happens in complex systems, and which we have ultimately integrated in our evaluation plan. I will now invite Drew, as one of the authors of the actor-based change framework, to provide an overview of this approach. Let's keep that line.
Thanks, Eugenia. So my name is Drew Koleros. I'm a principal researcher at Mathematica based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And as you can see here, I've worked across a number of sectors and with a number of different folks, public, private, bilateral, multilaterals across my career. And over that time within this evaluation space, I've really developed some interest and particular expertise around integrating complexity concepts and systems thinking into programs and evaluation. So some of the things that really get me excited are theories of change for complex interventions, designing systems change evaluations, and thinking about theory-based approaches to evaluations or how to integrate causal pathways analysis into evaluation. So I was really delighted when Eugenia, Janice, and Bénite got in touch to see if we could collaborate together on this approach, which I can get to on the next slide here, which is basically my experience with a number of colleagues. So I want to just name Sean Mulkern, Mark Oldenboving, and Danielle Stein. And I collaborated together to codify the approach that we had been using to understanding this core concept around what does a theory of change look like for a complex intervention, and how can we use that to design theory-based evaluation. Oftentimes what we found is that when people talked about theories of change for complex interventions, it just meant more boxes and more arrows, and it was really more complicated than actually understanding, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about change in complex systems? So the actor-based change framework is really a structured approach that helps you to develop an evaluable theory of change for complex systems change initiatives. And it's based on this notion that complex systems are made up of actors and relationships. And I just saw Joe's presentation right now, and I'm really thrilled at the coherence between the two approaches here. And from that notion, the framework really provides a set of tools and concepts that you can use to map out who the actors are, the relationships between them, and what's driving those current behaviors and relationships. And then from there, you can have a bit more of a structured approach to thinking about how to design an evaluation that helps you understand how interventions are targeting these system dynamics or drivers of change. So overall, on the next slide, I'll just share with you quickly. The approach is operationalized through 3 iterative and mutually reinforcing steps. And I think probably I should have had more of a circular graphic than these kind of like boxy graphic here. But ultimately, it starts off by understanding how change happens in complex systems through an actor-based system map. Then we use a behavioral framework, which you've now just been introduced to talk about behavior change. And those combination of those 2 steps then leads us to causal impact pathways. But it really is a cyclical and mutually reinforcing process. So I'll just go into each of these 3 very, very briefly. So on the next slide, it starts off with an actor-based system mapping. And this step is really grounded in complexity theory and the notion that complexity arises in any system in which decentralized agents or actors interact and adapt in different ways with their environment. So from this notion of understanding about how complex systems change, we understand that we need to be able to identify the interactions and behaviors of these individual actors. So it starts off by mapping out what is the system that we're talking about, the different actors and the relationships between them. Then on the next slide, we kind of get to, once we have that actor-based system map, the next step is then to focus on behavior change and understanding what's driving behaviors and relationships between them. Luckily, Joe did the hard work of explaining COM-B, so I won't get into that already. But ultimately, we use COM-B from that actor focus to start understanding the conditions that dictate these current actions and interactions among the system actors, and then understanding how different interventions are pulling on these levers or targeting these combinations of capabilities, opportunities, and motivations to lead to actor-based changes. And then from there, we identify causal impact pathways that are based on causal inference approaches from generative causation and more mechanistic approaches to understanding causation, where we develop first actor level pathways that help us understand the steps in the pathway from intervention to actor level change, and then using that broader system map then to understand changes in actors to wider system level changes and the contributions that interventions make. So that's a broad overview of the framework. Eugenia, I stuck to my 5 minutes. And with that, to see what it looked like in practice, je vais passer la parole à Bénite.
Merci, thank you, Drew. So my first step, so I'm going to speak about how we apply the framework to our evaluation context. I think the first step, before even looking into the framework, was for us, the evaluation team, to learn about the framework and to really assimilate the information. So that's a step that you shouldn't neglect if you want to apply such approach. So as Eugenia mentioned, so given the immense programming complexity, we've applied a case study approach that integrated the ABC framework to start building our understanding of what works in capacity building. We made the decision earlier on to organize case study geographically, as ultimately the security authorities in the targeted countries and the targeted actors really vary according to the national context. Our primary interest was to look at the result on what was happening on the ground. Are the programs making any change in practice? And are those changes reducing security threat? We chose 5 case study countries with different contexts. So we had Niger, Jordan, Jamaica, Vietnam, and now I'm forgetting one, I don't know why.
Guatemala.
Thank you, Eugenia. So as Drew described, we undertook a number of steps to apply this approach. So to a large extent, in each case study, the central development problem, that is the central outcome at the macro level, and the actor group associated with the problem were already determined through the funding programming intervention. We therefore started off by identifying what the ABC framework refers as the behavior change agenda, or the shift from a current state of practice to a desired state for those specific actor group. Central to this was identifying the behavioral condition, as Drew mentioned, the capacities, the opportunities, and the motivation that allow for this change to occur. We then developed the actor level theory of action for each individual project, which demonstrated the expected causal impact pathways. Next step was to combine these theory of actions together to articulate the ultimate theory of change for a case study that demonstrated the relationship and the interaction of all the actors around the problem. Our next major step was data collection planning, which included secondary analysis and evidence mapping of existing data. So just to make it clear, we used documentation available for each project to see what was already done before moving to the next step. Our next step was to identify the gaps. And with those gaps, we planned on-the-ground data collection. We used a simple ABC-focused data collection tools that was applied and modified according to the case study as well. And we went into the 5 case study countries to collect the data on the ground. For the analysis, we mapped the available evidence for each theory of action element for each project, and then we classified the information on whether there was sufficient evidence to confirm that the step occurred, or if the evidence was mixed or less strong, whether even it was insufficient or non-existent. I would like to highlight a few examples of some of these steps, what they look like. And yes, in theory, perfect, thank you. So this is an example of a causal impact pathway or a theory of action for an individual project. We were able to undertake this level of assessment for each individual project. Next slide, we have an example of the macro level theory of change that shows the pathways that actor level changes could bring about. So we see it on the screen. And then this was the only country where the only one of their 5 case studies where we're able to conduct a full overarching theory of change. This slide shows the roll-up analysis that summarizes evidence across all projects in relationship to each project theory of action. You can see that the further down in the theory of action you go, the less evidence we had confirmed that this step actually occurred. But most importantly, it was a great exercise because it allowed us to see some excellent results in terms of capacity building intervention, enabling for practice change. I'll now pass it to Eugenia to share some of the key learning of this process.
Thank you, Bénite. So our major learning was that we have to be aware that the context does not always allow to apply all the steps in the ABC framework, but applying its elements still works. So did we succeed in applying the approach? No, we didn't. We simply didn't have all the pieces that would allow us to establish the system-level relationships and influence. Only in one case we had sufficient information on that central development program and well-identified actor groups who could influence the change. And this happened to be our pilot test. So we originally had very high hopes with Drew based on that test case study, but then we had to adapt and identify the framework steps that were worth pursuing. In the end, it was the behavioral component of that framework that added the most usefulness for us. So we focused on identifying the change agenda developed with the application of the COM-B approach and the theory of action for each project. So be prepared to adapt. The second lesson, which Bénite already referred to, is that this approach is very resource intensive up front, and more importantly, it takes time to understand and shift your perspective. It takes practice. Having Drew guide us and build our capacity to internalize it was critical. It was quite difficult at first to shift from the logic model to the theory of action, but once you get it, then framework pieces come together, and we've seen that comment earlier on in the session when people talked about how this complexity gets overwhelming. But once you practice it a few times, you practice the application, it almost becomes second nature, perhaps now not as Drew's skills go, but pretty close. The next learning is that central to the actor-based change framework is to define the change agenda. What is the desired future state of practice? And in the capacity building context, it was quite tricky. It does require clarity over what capacity building entails, what successful institutionalization of the desired capacity looks like. Frankly, it wasn't always evident. The project level logic models were frequently too abstract. It took some time to define it for us up front, and then we tested it. We tested our and stakeholder understanding of the desired change during data collection. And the last lesson that I want to bring up is that when we applied the framework, we used it to develop an understanding of the theory of action of capacity building interventions. We did not use it to compare apples and oranges. But what it allows us is to gather information across different interventions, countries, actor groups, and test those linkages, how far you go down in the theory of action of the program, and what were the main contributing factors to it. There were also a few broad lessons related to assessing capacity building in general that I'd like to share. One is a need for field level data collection. The nature of security operations, complexity, and sensitivities do require field visits and the ability to speak with a broad range of implicated stakeholders and to do direct observations. It's also important to assess capacity building design and implementation, which is sometimes assumed that things are well done or appropriate because it is funded by the donor. That means capacity building is good. But you need to test those assumptions regarding the design and delivery. And again, that causal impact pathway allows you to do so. And finally, this is also a connection with the first presentation, is that capacity building could be a powerful diplomatic advocacy and relationship building vehicle which could be catalytic in its own right outside of being a direct transformational mechanism. So how do we capture this? Because it is often not formally identified or measured. So these were our key learnings, and I will now ask Khadija, who is a consultant for our Niger case study, to share how this process worked for her in a difficult security context, applying the framework across projects that were funded in Niger. Khadija will do her presentation in French, and Bénite will support the translation. Thank you.
I think I will try to do it in English.
We can't hear you. On peut pas t'entendre. Khadija?
Yes, can you hear me?
On peut pas on t'entend pas.
And while we are waiting for Khadija, I will invite the attendees to start maybe thinking about some of your questions and putting them in the Q&A app or the chat. And hopefully Khadija will be online with us shortly. If not, we will ask Bénite to summarize some of those steps.
Okay, we're having some technical issues, so I'm going to use my phone, and maybe she's calling me on my phone, and let's see if you guys can hear her. I'll see. Can you hear? Can you try to? Khadija?
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Bénite. I'm very sorry for the problematic on that. Okay. So I will try to do it in English, and if I have issue, you will translate in French. Okay, you do it all the time. Yes.
Okay.
So, okay, I applied the theory, advocacy theory in Niger, and I went also in the border of Mali and Niger. And first of all, it was easier to have a basic structure. In my previous experiences with other missions, the methodology was not that precise. So, yes, it was really easier for me to have a global picture of what was wanted. It was also structuration and methodology also have to better understand what is needed and also have to analyze the results. But there was also challenges, such as the short time to understand of these tools. It was a lot of information, and it take a really time to have the ability to adapt each project with the tools and from a distance, with few resources and with the insecurity context. For example, the data collection tool was very helpful, but it has some limitation in even the translation of languages. Because, for example, I remember I met some citizens of who live in the border of Niger and Mali, and who have really a security problem, and who can understand French. So we have to translate French or English. Huh? So we have to translate in their language and to adapt the tools to the language. It was kind of a big challenge for us. And also, yes, this was some factors, some external factors that was really a challenge for us. But globally, I really think that, as I said to Global Africa Canada, is that it just take practice to understand the tool, to do it again and again, and to really understand what is needed. And yes, so I think that's all I have to say.
Merci.
I hope that you understand what I say.
Yes, merci beaucoup, Khadija. Thank you so much. I hope everybody understood, but I think, as she said, it takes practice. At first, it's a bit challenging to learn, and then we adapt to the specific context, and we practice, and we get better at it. So, merci, Khadija. Je raccroche.
Thank you to all our presenters. That was really insightful. I'm opening the floor for questions. Feel free to drop them in the chat. In the Q&A, you can raise your hand as well if that's your preference. There is one question in the chat. Are concepts such as emergence and feedback loops also incorporated in the actor-based approach for theory of change development?
Drew, do you want to take
do you want me
that
to
one
take
first?
that one? Yeah, sure. So I think the presentation focused on, much more on the theory of action than the overall system level theory of change. And I think that was a really important insight that Eugenia and Bénite shared, is that oftentimes we're thinking about, oh, we want to impact system level change. But when we think about how long that takes and what the conditions are, that we have to start first with thinking about, where are the areas of intervention and how might that lead to some more incremental changes, for instance, within particular actor groups. So when you start to move from those actor level changes up to understanding the system level changes, that's ultimately where the framework would identify the feedback loops through relationships between the different actors and understanding how those change. And in terms of emergence, I think that ultimately comes up through if you were to pursue more of a systems level investigation, understanding your thinking through what actor level changes or changes in relationships you might expect to see, and then what you actually observe when you start to collect data in real time helps you understand how things are changing or adapting a bit differently than you originally thought.
Great, thank you. There was a few comments in the chat. Some people wanted the presentation. We will share that for those who asked. The recording will also be shared broadly for those who couldn't participate or who were late. There is a question in the Q&A here. Based on your evaluation experience, how can you best assess the capacity building needs and gaps of security in institutions in a diplomatic way, encouraging them to share concrete and factual data, as many may refrain from sharing their gaps in knowledge and capacity? Also, security institutions may consider this data, consider this, I think it's data, as classified and confidential. Maybe Eugenia, you want to take that on?
Sure. Sana was someone who was with us for a period of data collection. She is a consultant in a month. So if you want to say hi, raise your hand, Sana, and I'll let you in. But indeed, when you do assess security interventions, it becomes very sensitive, some of the information that exists, some of the numbers. And I think how to go about it, and that goes back to our point to you need to have an opportunity to do a field visit, because some information, and clearly outline the purpose of your visit, have the support of the implementing partner. When we went into the field, we have a support from our people, the embassy staff as well, who have connections. We had really prepared our broader stakeholder groups with whom we spoke, from ministry staff, from leadership to different other groups, about the purpose of how we collect the data. So in some cases, we were able to see the data where we went to meet with people. We also observed capacity in action. So data is not always necessarily, quantitative data, for example, is not necessarily the best predictor of the success. There were instances where capacity was established and it was very, very solid, but there were no incidents to report. So perhaps that preventative element worked very well. There are other elements where you could see the number of apprehensions, the number of increased searches, or other quantitative indicators that are, again, sensitive. So we don't put that information in our reports. And if you look at how we presented the data in the end, if we go back to that slide, you see that we looked at whether we have sufficient evidence to look at that particular element of the 3 area of action element or not. So in that case, we would know without telling, what the data said, that we have sufficient evidence to confirm that for this particular project or for this particular actor group, there was evidence that this change has occurred. So there are ways to do it without, disclosing sensitive data. And I think, Sana, do you have a chance to now speak? Let me see.
Yes, okay. I think, Eugenia, thank you very much. Yes, I remember. I totally agree with you. In order to share evidences is not just by collecting data, but also the site visits that we have conducted to the different locations were very helpful. So you could actually understand the context and see where are the issues and if there's an improvement. By even talking to people and already measuring the level of knowledge and also their level of motivation and engagement within the different activities and the projects that were supported by Global Affairs Canada. And also I would like to highlight, because the actors-based change, and this is something you already highlighted, which is very important also to look into the connections. And I remember from there was lots of collaboration, not just with between the security and military institutions, also with other stakeholders, and of course there was engagement and support from the Canadian embassy. So I think the connections aspect was really strong, and this is so when you work on this, enhancing the connections, also this could lead as well to better understand the issues or the gaps related to the capacity building, and to collect evidences regarding the improvement in capacity building programs. It was really very interesting, and because it involved really very practical, also I felt it was very practical exercise. So we could see really the changes and the activities ourselves on the ground. So we could also have the really observations without really looking into documents or papers or asking for statistics and figures. Yeah, thank you. This is maybe what I wanted to comment from my side.
Great.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Sana. It's nice to hear from you. If I can just add on to my colleagues, I think I would say I did a lot of the document review or the secondary analysis prior to going in the field mission. And it's, as Eugenia said, it was completely different for me to read versus to go on the ground and to see in Jordan and in Jamaica. So I was fortunate to go to those 2 case studies. And I think I would not have written or contributed to the final report in the same way if we didn't see for our own self. So that's the part that I think in some type of programs you can do remote data collection, but here really it wasn't ideal for the type of programming. And surprisingly, apart from the classified information that some of us were privy to, I was surprised considering the sensitive topic or the security context, but people were quite open, even explaining their limitation and where they were doing good and when they were not. For me, it was a surprising learning, and I think it really contributed well to the overall analysis and report. Voilà.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm still looking for some questions or comments in the chat or in the Q&A. Feel free to either raise your hand, put it in the chat, or ask some questions. I'd like to throw out a few comments for discussion to the group. How do the presented approaches and shared learnings resonate with your experiences? If anyone wants to comment, that would be interesting for us to learn. How do these approaches and processes be applied in your work, or could they be improved by anything you've learned today? Would the presented approaches help address the challenges in assessing advocacy and capacity building efforts you've identified in the past? So I'm throwing those out for discussion if anyone wants to comment or further that line of questioning. Our presenters would be happy to tackle them and discuss them further.
I guess we were very clear with our presentations.
Maybe.
Or perhaps the complexity became too daunting, one of the two.
Well, it is clear that that it's a slow process that takes time. You know, it's very involved and may not be successful. Initially, behavior change is hard to assess, and that came out in both of the discussions. We do have one question on the CFLI. The focus of the CFLI has shifted to achieving gender transformative results. What are your findings from your evaluation in gaps or improvement needed in the assessment framework and tools for setting realistic expectations, better identifying and assessing such results? And as said, it is hard to achieve in a short term with very small scale funding. Any good practices to share? I'll throw that to Giovanna, if you could comment on that.
Thank you. That's a big question. It's a lot of questions, and it's a big question. I'm very sorry that Silvia, I think she's left us now, because she is the one obviously involved long term in CFLI. Itad jumped in 2 years ago to support and strengthen that specific part. So I am not the best person to answer this question, but maybe I can reflect a bit on the identifying and assessing such results on gender transformative results. Also, Silvia would be the best person because she does a lot of feminist evaluation and all that. I'm sorry, you're not getting her. You're getting me. I guess my reflection from that specific exercise that we did 2 years ago is that the key probably is to first make the framework context specific. So we were asked to develop something that could be applied in a lot of different missions across a lot of different topics. So we ended up with a theory that's very high level and a framework that was, generic enough to apply to everything, and but hopefully narrow enough to be able to be applied to the right things. And so I guess my suggestion would be to take that framework and make it context specific, including in gender and that types of gender improvements and realistic expectations and all of that in specific context, and looking at those. That is my not very informed answer.
Yeah, well, we'll make sure that Silvia has a chance to respond to that question specifically after the session.
Zahra, if I could just kind of add and plus one
Sure.
to what Joe was saying, I really think that the way that she explained it is the right way to think about it. The difference, somebody asked about log frames and theories of change. A log frame is about results, which are specific to a context or specific to a program. Change is different. It's about how things change and from a current to a future state. So when you start thinking broadly about change, you're getting to that concept, COM-B in some ways, it's just a conceptual theory about, like, in general, how organizations change, how individuals change, how security sector actors change. It has to be nested. It has to be detailed out to specific context, whether that's a specific actor group, a specific country, whatever that is. And when you do that, but use that same anchor as a conceptual framework, you can zoom in and zoom out to the context specific, and that allows you to do some cross-case comparisons. So I think it's the right way to be thinking about things.
Great, thank you. Is there any other comments in the chat that you'd like the presenters to address? Would the presenters like to conclude with anything that you've heard, wrap up any final thoughts that you may have?
We are definitely sharing some resources, and if you have any particular information or requests to us, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. There will be contact information. Sarah, I believe you've provided it already. But one of the things that keeps repeating again and again is that context matter. I think you can have the best laid plans, but you have to be ready to adapt them based on the context. And we were lucky enough, I think, in our experience, that we had, as again, tools were generic enough that we focused on understanding the targeted change. Then we focused with the tools on every element of what behavior was changed, which practice was changed, what were the motivation factors, what were the opportunity factors. And that consistencies allowed us to do some very important comparisons. And at the level of an individual project, cross-project comparisons, and aggregated at the level of our portfolio analysis, our case studies.
Thank you, Eugenia. That was great. I'm going to wrap up our session then today, seeing as there is no specific questions for the panelists and the chat is a little quiet. Thank you for being here and for actively listening and for your shared perspectives to the presenters, for presenting and taking the time for doing this. You saw on the screen before, which we'll leave you with, is a set of resources on theory-based approaches, and you can use that as you need. We'd love it if you could fill out the evaluation form in the gLOCAL page, and we'd welcome your feedback. We invite you to the second gLOCAL presentation led by our division at Global Affairs tomorrow. It will include a presentation on a tool developed to measure a program's alignment with locally led development approach. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for the presenters, and I wish you a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Gracias.